So my apologies for the delay. There's a further document on surrogate testing I wanted to just put up on screen, and we're just making those arrangements, but I'll slot that in as and when the document's available.
Thank
you. Continuing then with the narrative in relation to Professor Cash and the introduction or delay in introduction of hepatitis C screening, we looked at Dr. Mitchell's account of the meeting with Ortho at the Strand Palace Hotel in August of 1989. Also in August of 1989, there's a letter from Dr. Cash and others published in the Lancet. It's at NHBT 0083819. 26th of August 1989. The first letter on the left-hand side is authored by Dr. Contreras and Dr. Barbara, and I can ask them about that. The second letter, which begins towards the bottom of the page, reads as follows. Whilst we share the views of your August 5th editorial on the importance of the new detection systems for hepatitis C antibodies, especially in the context of screening blood donations, we take issue with the last point made by Professor Köln, I'm not quite sure how to pronounce that, and colleagues in the correspondence section of the same issue. And then the letter goes on to deal with this issue of confirmatory testing, which we've seen was a matter of concern and some importance to Professor Cash. The apparent absence of a confirmatory test will cause serious problems for blood transfusion services, which are likely to bear the brunt of sensitive donor counselling. A repeatedly reactive ELISA test is suggestive but not definitive evidence for antibody. We accept that the existing difficulty, use of the same antigen, is scientifically less than satisfactory, but it is better than nothing. Orthodiagnostic systems should make available as a matter of urgency appropriate reagents and/or tests, so that even when an identical antigen is used, assay systems that are fundamentally different from the marketed ELISA screening tests can be used for confirmation testing. Of no less importance for blood donors, as you've indicated in your editorial, is the need for Ortho and/or Chiron to deposit the sequence of the viral genome in the GenBank database. These matters are so important that they should be taken up by the government health departments in view of the impending European legislation on blood transfusion. European governments are especially well placed to coordinate such actions. So we see that emphasis there on confirmation testing being expressed by Professor Cash, along with Doctors McClelland, Abaniak, Brooks and Follett. There were further communications between Professor Cash and Ortho about the issue of confirmation testing. I'm not going to go to all of them, but I'll give a couple of references for the transcript. So NHBT 00274882 was Professor Cash's letter of the 3rd of October 1989 to Ortho, again asking in relation to the test and asking for supplies to be made available for reagent purposes. And then if we look at NHBT 40188_123, we can see the next development was Ortho writing to Professor Cash on the 27th of November 1989, saying, I'm pleased to be able to inform you that the export permit for the Ortho HCV antibody ELISA test has been approved by the US Food and Drug Administration. This means that we can now supply product labelled for in vitro diagnostic use instead of research use only. There was then a further letter, I'm not going to go to it, but from Ortho to Professor Cash about the confirmation testing. The reference for your notes, sir, and for the benefit of anyone who wants to look at it, is NHBT 40188_122. And then Professor Cash wrote again on the issue of confirmatory testing to Ortho. Again, no need to put it up on screen, but at NHBT 40188_127. If we could next have up, please, SBTS 40155_102. So this was a letter from Dr. Ludman to Professor Cash, 5th of December 1989, in relation to the introduction of routine anti-HCV screening of blood donors. And Dr. Ludman set out this perspective, picking it up in the second line of the letter. I realise that the present antibody test is not ideal and that confirmatory tests as well as a more sensitive antibody test would be advantageous. The present test may well not identify all non-A, non-B infectious units, and furthermore there may be false positive results. So setting out there essentially what the reasons were for hesitancy. And then Dr. Ludman says, on balance, however, it seems to me that a case can be made for using the present anti-HCV assay to screen all donations and discarding all positive units. I appreciate some of the drawbacks of introducing a screening test for infectious donations of blood, but I wonder whether we should not be considering the recipients. I'm mindful of the debate about and enormous effort that went into the setting up of anti-HTLV3 screening in 1985. I well remember the view being put forward in early 1985 that anti-HTLV3 testing should be introduced and that positive units should be discarded without informing the donor. If this policy had been adopted, one possible outcome would have been fewer transfusion cases of HTLV3 infection in recipients of a low number of products, e.g. red cells. It could be argued that we are in a similar position now with anti-HCV testing. You will be as familiar as I am with the long-term complications of non-A, non-B hepatitis. I fear that if there is delay in the introduction of anti-HCV testing, we will be exposing patients to preventable viral infection. I do appreciate that the decision to introduce an imperfect test is difficult, but on balance, I would encourage SMBTS to do so at an early date. You may have many cogent arguments against what I'm suggesting, and if so, I should be most interested to learn of them. So that was Dr. Ludman, December 1989, and of course we know it's nearly 2 years after that that the testing is introduced in most of England, Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland. There's a further perspective at PRSE 301562. This is Dr. Bolton to Professor Cash, 21st of February 1990, and we will be able to ask Dr. Bolton himself about this. If we pick it up in the second paragraph, could I just add that in spite of obvious difficulties with the current ortho-ELISA assay, susceptibility to stickiness, unreliability of predictive value with heat-treated samples, etc., I have developed a very strong feeling that the screening of donors for HCV antibodies should be introduced at the earliest possible opportunity. This is not because of the science, but because there appears to be little doubt that people have contracted HCV as a result of transfusions which they would not have received had those transfusions been screened for HCV antibody. Furthermore, there are apparently 5 known cases of HCC due to PTH. The reason, therefore, I'm assuming PTH is obviously post-transfusion hepatitis. I'm assuming HCC is being used there to refer to hepatocellular carcinoma. The reason, therefore, for my proposing this view is actually one based on future litigation. I'm pretty convinced that the NBTS and SNBTS will find legal action taken against them in about 10 years' time from persons who have sustained post-transfusion hepatitis as a result of receiving HCV antibody containing blood which was presumably infectious for HCV at the time. So a perspective there from Dr. Bolton, who had been indeed working in the field of haematology more generally before taking up a position within SNBTS. In terms of events in the course then of 1990, we'll be picking that up with other witnesses in due course over the coming weeks and months. In relation to Professor Cash himself, I'm going to pick the picture up next in 1991. NHBT 5076_006. This is Dr. Gunson writing to regional transfusion directors in England and Wales on the 22nd of January 1991, but copied to Professor Cash. We see that from the bottom of the letter. And this is an announcement of the Department of Health's position. The Department of Health have agreed that routine testing of all blood donations for anti-HCV can be put into operation. I have been asked to try and ensure that testing starts simultaneously in regional transfusion centres in England and Wales, and that it is coordinated with commencement of testing in Scotland. And then there's a request to the regional transfusion directors to let Dr. Gunson know what they consider to be the earliest date they could commence testing. Paragraph 4 refers to the need still to conclude the financial arrangements to cover both routine screening and supplementary tests. Paragraph 5 refers to proposals for a protocol for the carrying out of the tests, which is still to be discussed within the Department of Health. And then 6 says, I will inform Ortho and Abbott that routine screening for anti-HCV has been approved and that will inform them of the starting date in due course. If we then turn to NHBT 5073_033, we will see Professor Cash's response to Dr. Gunson's memo. So this is dated the 24th of January. Many thanks for your memo of the 22nd of January. I have liaised with SNBT SRTDs, and we are unanimous in advising, with the greatest respect but in the strongest possible terms, that anti-HCV donation testing should not be commenced in the UK BTS until after the Gulf conflict is over, or at least until such time as we are confident our blood collection and microbiology testing teams can cope with what will be quite substantial changes and increased workloads. Just at the moment, there are a lot of exhausted staff in our RTCs, and I would judge that when the troops go in, our current frenetic activity will be sustained. We would be most grateful if you would see ministers are appropriately advised. We would wish you to emphasise that we do not intend to be obstructive in any way, but believe this increased load, HCV donation tests, in the present circumstances, could lead to GMP, good manufacturing practice, failures in existing overstretched programmes. Over the page, we remain firmly committed to starting on the same day as our NBTS colleagues, and if pressed by ministers, I would suggest in the circumstances a May/June date should be considered. However, I would much prefer to wait another month and then respond to your letter. So you will see what appears to be a fairly unequivocal a communication from Professor Cash that it should not be introduced until later in the course of 1991. And the reason that's given is essentially the workload and the need to be in a position to deal with the screening programme, having regard to additional burdens anticipated in relation to the impact of the Gulf War. Dr. Gunson replied on the 28th of January 1991. I'm not proposing to go to that letter, but the reference for the transcript is PRSE 304144. And Dr. Gunson agreed that an immediate start was entirely impractical. There's then a further letter from Professor Cash at PRSE 0002763. 15th of February 1991, and this is in relation to the discussion of a start date for the programme. It says, thinking ahead to the end of June 1991 and checking over previous correspondence, I think we need to do one more thing in the not too distant future. I refer to defining what start date will mean. It's a rerun of the HIV-1 programme. Whatever the start date will be, do we mean that by 9 a.m. on that day, all RTC products and those in associated hospital blood banks will be HCV screen negative? The definition of RTC products will, of course, be those not from BPL or PFC. If we adopt this definition, then clearly testing will have to commence well in advance of the start date. Next, we will need, as on previous occasions, to obtain a policy decision with regard to plasma already in bond at both fractionation centres and awaiting uplift at RTCs for the fractionation centres. If a decision is made to test aliquots from these donations, the task is doable but formidable. Over the page, sorry to pester, but I suspect you will have to pursue Dr. Mehta's committee on these topics. Once again, we would very much like the SNBTS to stay in line with NBTS/BPL. There was then a discussion of the start date at the meeting of the Advisory Committee on Transfusion-Transmitted Diseases on the 25th of March 1991. That's NHBT 5073_063, please, Shomik. So we'll see it was a meeting chaired by Dr. Gunson. Professor Cash was present along with Drs. Contreras, Krask, Follett, Mitchell, Wagstaff and Professor Tedder. If we go to the second page, paragraph 4 is headed Introduction of Anti-HCV Tests into NBTS and SNBTS, the starting date and its definition. The proposed starting date of 1st of July, so that's what's recorded as being the proposed date, presented difficulties since it was considered essential that the second generation test from both Orth and Abbott should be evaluated prior to the commencement of routine tests. Our ortho tests were being evaluated by Dr. Barbara at North London RTC. He had to date only received pre-production batches of the tests. It was known that there were procedural differences between the pre-production and production batches. These test kits should be available within 10 days to 2 weeks. The situation with Abbott was uncertain since they'd not yet given an official date for launching their second generation test. The preliminary results obtained by Dr. Barbara on the test kits from 3 manufacturers were reviewed. It was agreed that further testing at all 3 RTCs was essential. It was agreed that Newcastle RTC would provide samples from their donors in the study for Dr. Barbara, and Glasgow RTC would do the same once Abbott had provided second generation test kits, since this would avoid thawing the samples more than once. Chair was asked to contact Abbott and from the information he received recommend a starting date for the commencement of tests. 4.14, it was agreed that testing of blood and plasma donations would commence on a specified date. There would not be retrospective tests carried out on donations collected prior to that date. There's then a discussion about confirmatory testing over the page, but I'm not proposing to go through that. So you'll see there, but by this point in time, there was a proposed starting date of the 1st of July, but a question mark being raised in relation to that proposed start date because of what was said to be the need to evaluate the new second generation tests that had been produced. And if we look next at SCGV 40163_053, and we go to the next page. This is a letter from Professor Cash to Mr. David McIntosh with an SNBTS, dated the 27th of March 1991, and it refers to the meeting, the minutes of which we've just looked at, and says this: you will want to know that our NBTS colleagues are struggling on a number of accounts to meet the 1st of July deadline, as previously discussed and I thought agreed. We believe the fundamental problem is one of financial resourcing. At a meeting of the UK BTS Advisory Committee on Transfusion-Transmitted Diseases in Manchester on Monday last, so that's the meeting we just looked at, the following was agreed. Harold Gunson would advise DOH that the 1st of July start date should be delayed until such time as an evaluation of the new generation of HCV screening tests have been completed. If this is accepted, it could push a start date to September. And then what is recorded is Dr. Mitchell and Professor Cash both supporting that proposal. And then B, the definition of a start date now proposed will be exactly as stated, the date when routine HCV donation testing will commence. NBTS colleagues do not wish to accept the original proposal that the definition of a start date will be that on that date all RTC products issued would have been HCV tested. top of the next page, more anon when things are clearer, exclamation mark. So that was Professor Cash's communication to Mr McIntosh of his understanding of the decision that had been taken and the putting back of the start date. There's then a communication from Dr Gunson, NHBT 5073_065. This is a letter which, as is plain, it's intended to send to all regional transfusion directors in England and Wales, dated the 3rd of April 1991. It's copied to Professor Cash. We don't need to look at it, but that's apparent from the second page. And then you will see what Dr Gunson sets out. You'll recall that in my letter to you of the 15th of February, I suggested that 1st of July 1991 might be an appropriate date to commence anti-HCV screening of blood donations. You may be aware that since the 3-centre trial of anti-HCV tests was completed, Ortho and Abbott have produced second-generation test kits which have additional antigens to the C100 of the test we have evaluated. There may also be other companies supplying anti-HCV tests. The Department of Health has agreed that there should be a second-round comparative evaluation of anti-HCV test kits at the Newcastle, North London and Glasgow RTCs, together with appropriate confirmatory testing. It has not yet been possible to commence the evaluation using production batches of the second-generation tests referred to above, and one of these will not be available until later this month. It is undoubtedly in our interest that this evaluation takes place. However, to complete the study and become operational by the 1st of July 1991 is too tight a schedule. It's difficult to state precisely a revised date, but I think we should aim to commence routine screening for anti-HCV by the 1st of September 1991. And over the page, it says, I thought you should have this information as soon as possible. And there we can see the list of those to whom the letter is copied, including Professor Cash. And then Professor Cash's response to that is at NHBT 0000191_133. This is 5th of April. Dear Harold, thank you for your letter of the 3rd of April on this topic. My colleagues would wish you to know that this most recent development leading to a start date in September 1991 has the SNBTS Director's fullest support. Now, it's right that I should point out that in his evidence to the Penrose inquiry, and we'll look at some bits and pieces of that, but time doesn't permit an exhaustive trawl through it, Professor Cash expressed a degree of unhappiness about the putting back of the date from the 1st of July 1991. And he described what he said had been some difficult and distressing telephone conversations over a particular weekend with Dr. Gunson. It was explored with him during his oral testimony that the contemporaneous correspondence didn't necessarily reflect that. And I'll give you some references in due course to some of the passages in his Penrose evidence.
This does say, my colleagues would wish you to know. Was there any discussion about whether, in practice, that meant my colleagues and I?
I can't recall, I'm afraid. Or rather, I don't recall there being any particular discussion of the wording in that respect. I can double check, but I don't remember that coming up as an issue in the oral evidence. But I may be wrong. Professor Cash gave evidence to the Penrose inquiry on, I think, 10 separate occasions.
Yes.
And his evidence on this particular, on the issue of HCV testing, surrogate testing and then anti-HCV screening, I think spread over 3 different occasions, separated by a number of days or weeks. So I may need to double check that.
While I'm raising issues, just one further question. It's really going back to PRSE 302763. And this is where Professor Cash queries what starting means, start date. And he's referring there to plasma already in bond and waiting uplift. and presumably other products, RTC products, those in associated hospital blood banks. So he's raising the possibility that after, if as we've seen, it is likely that on the 1st of September, what was happening was testing of all new supplies. The supplies currently in the system might very well have been infected because they hadn't been tested.
Yes.
And that has repercussions, if it's right, it may have repercussions for the accuracy of the start date adopted for Skipton.
It might indeed, sir, yes, absolutely.
Although no one, of course, would have had that in contemplation at this stage, but yes, thank you.
Now, what then happened in May of 1991 is that the director of the Newcastle Regional Transfusion Centre decided not to await the universal start date for the autumn of 1991. And he explains his position at NHBT 5074_014. So this is a communication from Dr. Lloyd, Director of the Regional Transfusion Centre at Newcastle, from whom we hope the inquiry will be hearing. It's 2nd of May 1991, directed to all directors of transfusion services, copied to, amongst others, copied to Dr. Gunson and Professor Cash. Says this: as you know, there was a date of 1st of July set for hepatitis C antibody testing. Fairly recently, this was changed with a provisional date set for September 1991. In view of the fact that we were already set up for testing, I have decided to keep to the July date. By 1st of July, all units of blood for transfusion in the northern region will be negative for hepatitis C antibody. My personal view is that not to test now that we have the ability to test would be indefensible under the current product liability legislation. I appreciate that individual directors may take a different view on the potential liability under the Consumer Protection Act, but the fact that this centre is testing should not materially alter that judgment. I would be interested to know if any centre is currently carrying out any additional tests, such as hepatitis B core testing or ALT testing, and if so, what criteria are being used to select donors/samples for testing. Now, I'm not going to explore in any, to any extent the decision taken by Dr. Lloyd. As I say, that will be for future hearings. I draw attention to it because it's the response from Professor Cash that's relevant for today's purposes. In what you may think were characteristically powerful terms, Professor Cash wrote to Dr. Lloyd on the 7th of May 1991, NHBT 5074_019. And he says this: I received your copy letter to the UK BTS directors with quite profound dismay, which I suspect will be shared by all my SNBTS colleagues. I cannot but conclude that this unilateral action is both disgraceful and mischievous. On a previous occasion, I've expressed concern about NBTS management and have been taken to task when I use the word shambles. Your action on HCV donation testing reveals beyond doubt that the NBTS is descending into a position now more accurately described as chaos. It seems to be dog-eat-dog time, Hugh, and I would suggest it is also time when you should remove the heading National Blood Transfusion Service from your headed notepaper, and time for you and any of your staff who serve UK BTS and or NBTS committees and working parties to be excluded. Now, it's right to say, I think, and only fair to say, that when he gave his evidence to the Penrose inquiry, Professor Cash did express a degree of regret about the precise way in which he'd expressed his views in that letter. But the sentiment that this was an inappropriate course to take was shared by a number of other regional transfusion directors who all wrote to Dr. Lloyd. And those include Dr. Contreras, Dr. Martlew, Dr. Bolton and Dr. Entwistle, but we can ask them directly about that over the next few weeks. Dr. Lloyd responded to Professor Cash at NHBT 40192_031. In what you may think are quite dignified terms, Dear John, thank you for your colourful letter. Your views are graphically put, as I would have expected. I too have spent many hours looking at material relating to HIV litigation, but my conclusion is different to the one that you appear to be drawing. The situation now is quite different to that which existed when HIV-1 testing commenced, and I personally believe that to start HCV testing to the original schedule is the correct decision, even if it appears unpalatable to some. To suggest that my action was, in your words, mischievous is to impart motives to this action which were not mine. If you wish to question motives, then perhaps you should be asking why a vague September start date has replaced, with little explanation, a firm date in July. Then, continuing with the position in relation to May of 1991, Professor Cash wrote to Dr. Gunson on the 8th of May, NHBT 5074_024, he referred to the Newcastle saga. That's obviously a reference to Dr. Lloyd's decision. Then he set out a number of observations. He says, paragraph 1, it will, I suggest, be important that all participants other than Newcastle start at the same time. And then he sets out a number of observations about the national large-scale validation study, which he was addressing, and suggesting that this should be in 2 phases. I'm not going to go through the detail of that. If we go over the page, he again sets out various recommendations as to which centres, or centres using the different tests. And then if we go to paragraph 5, in relation to the position in Scotland, he says that right now it looks as though when full screening begins, Edinburgh, Glasgow and Aberdeen will opt for Abbott. Thus, it would seem to me that we should offer Glasgow only into this national UK study, and the MBTS will have to find 2 ortho centres, because Newcastle have already opted for Abbott. I'm sure Dundee and Inverness using ortho would be happy to pitch in, but their donation collections are relatively small, and this could be viewed as a disadvantage to ortho. And then he goes on to talk about the confirmatory testing associated with the study. Also, in May of 1991, Dr. Gunson advised, don't propose to go to it, but I'll just give you the reference, NHBT 40192_024, that the Department of Health had reviewed the position in light of Dr. Lloyd's decision to commence testing early, and had concluded that the September date should remain, and they were awaiting, amongst other matters, the second generation tests receiving FDA licenses. If we pick matters up, still in May of 1991, with a further letter from Professor Cash to Dr. Gunson at NHBT 40192_039, this raises some wider concerns. So the first paragraph says, I can well understand that last week was a time of preoccupation with the immediate tasks associated with damage limitation following the unilateral actions of Newcastle RTC. On the first cold and wet Monday morning after that eventful week, I feel bound to raise with you and colleagues a matter of fundamental importance to the future of the UK blood transfusion service. It has always been the view in Scotland, both in the Scottish Office and throughout the SNBTS, that the introduction of additional microbiology donation screening tests would be subject to ministerial approval. Our understanding of this issue goes back many years to when SHHD directly intervened to stop one SNBTS centre unilaterally starting hepatitis B surface antigen donation testing. In recent times, evidence that ministers wish to acquire a firmer grip on this activity came with the establishment of the Advisory Committee on the Virological Safety of Blood. This development in principle was warmly welcomed in Scotland. In the past months, we've witnessed 2 happenings in the NBTS which unequivocally indicate that our interpretation of the policy referred to above may be seriously flawed. I refer to the unilateral action of BPL demanding ALT donation testing and the most recent HCV episode in Newcastle. It's difficult not to conclude, particularly having witnessed the passivity of the Department of Health on both occasions, that ministers no longer wish to be involved in this exercise and that their current intention is to leave such matters to respective health authorities. Should my conclusions be confirmed, then I would wish to emphasise that I deplore this development. It will lead to chaos which will become evident in the courts. To the best of my knowledge, this is a development in the management of blood transfusion services which is unique in Europe. And then the next paragraph, you'll recall that I proposed several years ago that there be established an authoritative ministerial advisory group which concerned itself with all policy issues relating to the safety of blood donations. I do believe this matter now requires urgent consideration. Such a group should not be restricted to virus transmission and must, above all, be authoritative. It is just possible that this issue, perhaps more than any other, can only be resolved satisfactorily in the UK by the establishment of a centrally managed national blood transfusion service, for authority is ultimately achieved by the allocation of funds. It is difficult not to conclude that we are rapidly reaching a situation when all the UK BTS groups we have established, particularly those associated with BTS guidelines, should be abandoned. It is every man for himself time, and against the background of the development on harmonising quality in Europe, the recent episodes in the UK must surely be a matter for grave concern. So that was a more general observation on the organisation and structure of the National Blood Transfusion Service. Returning to the specific issue about hepatitis C donation testing and its introduction, Professor Cash authored document at NHBT 40192_144. This was 14th of May 1991, addressed by Professor Cash to SNBTS board members, and you'll see the subject is HCV donation testing. It refers to an article in the Sunday Times on the 11th of May, and then says this in the first main paragraph. Since early 1984, there have been growing concern throughout the UK BTS that microbiology donation screening kits should be appropriately evaluated before their large-scale use is instituted. The primary concern in this context has been for the UK BTS to ensure as much as is possible that every effort has been made by kit manufacturers to maximise both sensitivity and specificity. And then he refers to the need for the task to evaluate which kits might give rise to false negatives or false positives. If we then go further down, if we go over the page, and picking it up in the second paragraph, he says the standards set by the UK BTS in the HIV exercise have been extended to the HCV kits. The SNBTS has contributed substantially to this exercise. The results have been interesting and a little worrying. And he goes on to give detail of that and also to refer to the outcomes in relation to confirmatory testing. And then, if we pick it up in that fourth paragraph, as the UK BTS validating team is in the process of advising ministers and RTCs that both these kits could be used and that UK BTS should commence full-scale screening on the 1st of July 1991, the kit manufacturers announced their intention to withdraw their kits and replace them with second-generation kits. These new kits were claimed by the manufacturers to be an improvement over those tested by the UK BTS validation team, but no satisfactory data was available to confirm this at this time, and it was noted that the FDA had not yet approved their use. It was concluded that an evaluation of these second-generation kits should be undertaken as a matter of urgency, and a scheduled start time for full RTC screening was estimated to be 1st of September 1991. And then he sets out conclusions saying if we extend these UK observations to Scotland, then each year we can predict without HCV donation testing the following. There'll be approximately 170 donations infected with HCV and placed at issue. And then he goes on to give further details in relation to that. Top of the next page. He then sets out various figures, and fourth paragraph down says, In simple terms, we would have approximately 1,900 donors to deal with who we believed were false positives. It goes on then to talk about costs, and then in the last paragraph says this: it would seem prudent and responsible to pursue the idea of full evaluation of the second generation HCV test kits. And then skipping a sentence beyond this, representations are being made in the light of the developments in Newcastle RTC as to whether in future the SNBTS is bound to a UK BTS approach with regard to donation testing against a background of ministerial involvement. And then the document concludes over the page, but I don't need to trouble you with that. So it would appear from this document that Professor Cash was effectively agreeing with the need for there to be this further evaluation of the second generation kits for the reasons which he there set out. There were some further communications between Gunson and Cash in relation to the suggestion of the need for a ministerial advisory group, but I'm not proposing to trouble you with that. There was then a further meeting of the Advisory Committee on Transfusion Transmitted Diseases on the 10th of June 1991. I'm not going to go to it. The reference for the transcript is NHBT 5044_003. There was a discussion there of a number of matters, including how to handle donations and donors found to be hepatitis C positive. If we then look at PRSC 301183, there's a further letter from Dr. Lloyd to Professor Cash. This is dated the 4th of July. Says, I was pleased to see you at the recent meeting in York and thank you for burying the hatchet. May I respond by apologising for any problems that I've caused you by starting testing this April? And then Dr. Lloyd sets out his broader concern. On a wider theme, I'm concerned that the UK seems to be dragging its feet over testing. I appreciate that many questions are not answered, and for some transfusion centres, their organisation will find it difficult to introduce another test. By waiting until everyone's problems, etc., are sorted out, we run the risk of accepting the lowest common denominator. I somehow doubt that you would be happy to accept the lowest common denominator approach. The attitude of UK transfusion centres has often not been very positive, and when we look back at the plasma procurement situation south of the border over the years, it presents a very dismal picture. A little more fire and enthusiasm for transfusion is required, and a little less local protectionist activity and negative thinking. There were then various communications. Again, we've set them out in our written presentation. I don't think I need to go to them in relation to some of the detailed working out of the introduction of the hepatitis C screening. So there's a letter from Professor Cash in July to SNBTS directors and communications between Professor Cash and Dr. Gunson in August in relation to the position regarding confirmatory testing. But I'm not going to trouble you with looking at those now. There are, however, just two documents further to look at on the issue of hepatitis screening. The first is NHBT 5077_061. It's a letter from Professor Cash to Dr. Gunson, 8th of August 1991, headed Post-Transfusion Hepatitis HCV Future Litigation, so anticipating that there may be litigation in the future rising out of the delay in introducing hepatitis C screening. And he says this: I do believe it is important that consideration is given to the formulation of an agreed statement of the UK BTS professional position with regard to HCV donation testing. It seems to me that the key elements which need to be addressed in the context of a defence position in subsequent litigations are as follows. 1, why didn't UK BTS introduce surrogate ALT/anti-HBC testing? 2, why was anti-HCV testing delayed until the 1st of September 1991? Those obviously are the two key questions He doesn't give his answer in this letter, but simply says perhaps we might wish to give this a run around at the next ACTTD meeting. That's the Advisory Committee on Transfusion Transmitted Disease. On the other hand, you may feel this would be the most appropriate forum. I think there's a not missing from that letter. And then over the page, he continues, you will see from the enclosed, which I'm sure you've seen, and that's a reference to an article in The Independent, patients may sue over hepatitis C in blood. The cause for my concern and why I feel this matter is of some urgency, you promised to send me a set of Dr. Mehta's committee minutes, they haven't yet arrived. And we can see that the enclosure is the extract from the Independent newspaper there. So the other document I wanted to ask you to look at, sir, on this issue is Professor Cash's Penrose inquiry witness statement on this topic of screening for hepatitis C. It's at PRSE 0002529. We looked at some of Professor Cash's observations about the advisory committees, which he sets out on the first 2 pages of this statement yesterday. I'm not going to go back to that. If we go to the 3rd page, but if I pick it up on the bottom half of the page, there's a, I think, what might be described as a general set of observations from Professor Cash. He says this, to the best of my recollection, we sought to avoid the difficulties we'd had in 1985 with the introduction of HIV donation screening. Whilst we anticipated that once again, SHHD would insist on the primacy of DHSS with respect to the timing of the introduction of HCV donation screening in the UK, we believed in 1989 that the SNBTS should generate significant independent data as soon as possible, which could be used as a lever for timely central action. And then if we go over the page, he was asked some questions about the decisions of the Advisory Committee on the Virological Safety of Blood, of which he was not a member. And his answer B is, I was not privy to the business of ACVSB, but I was advised, he doesn't say in this by whom, and I can't recall without checking if it's clarified in his oral evidence or not. I was advised that DHSS did not move to promote HCV kit assessment until January 1990, and that the anticipated deliberations on this topic by ACVSB were thereafter deferred until April 1990. Efforts to obtain the reasons for this deferral were not successful. That said, it's of interest that in August 1989, the need for introducing another donation screening test had not yet been considered by SHHD. And then if we look at the next page, top of page 5, there's reference to communications between Professor Cash and Dr. Gunson, and some, not all of which I've shown you in the course of the morning, sir. And we see at the top of the page is a reference to a letter in which Professor Cash refers to, as at August 1989, to it being only a matter of time before the new testing programme would be commenced. The question that's posed then by the Penrose inquiry is, at this point, was he, i.e. Professor Cash, envisaging a shorter time period than in fact eventuated? Answer, yes. I anticipated that the SNBTS/WBTS ortho kit assessment would reveal that we had a kit which would allow us to make a start on the basis that the specificity would be acceptable and sensitivity would be better than no screening. And then if we look towards the bottom of this page, just above the last few lines, there's a question posed about the interrelationship between the respective health departments. So the question is, were the health departments for Scotland, England, Wales and Northern Ireland working jointly on the decision, or was it an issue on which Scotland would follow whatever decision was taken in England? Was the formal position that the decision for Scotland would be taken in Scotland independently from the decision for England? Answer, from the several conversations I had with Dr. McIntyre, medical officer within SHHD, I never had any doubt that although the decision for Scotland would finally be taken in Scotland, the SHHD operational policy on this issue was to defer totally to the primacy of DHSS, and that Scottish ministers would fall in line with their London-based colleagues. I was further advised that this position had been conveyed to the CSA, an aspect of management which I assumed ensured that the release of funds permitting the purchase of kits for donation screening by SNBT SRTCs was actually in the hands of the CSA's finance director, who was to await instructions from SHHD. And then if we look at the bottom half of the page, you'll see, sir, from the text that's not in bold print, so the Penrose inquiry's summary refers to the Ortho Rome Symposium in September 1989, refers to then a meeting of or various meetings of the ACVSB, and indeed refers to the judgment of Mr. Justice Bolton in the subsequent National Blood Authority proceedings. And then the question is posed as to whether anyone has any comments or recollections of events at this time. And this was Professor Cash's comments. My recollections are that this was the beginning of a period of much unhappiness and frustration. It began with the pressure I put on Dr. Gunson to reveal why the ACVSB Secretariat had deferred considering the existing HCV kit evaluation data generated in 1989 until April 1990. When the deferred ACVSB meeting finally took place on the 23rd of April 1990, I discovered after a briefing from Dr. Perry that both he and Dr. Gunson had argued in committee that there was already sufficient data for ACVSB to recommend to ministers the introduction of a first-generation HCV donation screening as soon as possible. This was a view I shared. I was advised that Drs. Gunson and Perry's views were rejected, and instead the committee agreed to mount its own HCV kit evaluation exercise. I recall that Dr. Gunson was distressed at this turn of events and repeatedly emphasised to me that the ACVSB was in the hands of DHSS officials and the academic virologists, and that his role as DHSS advisor was being openly challenged. More unhappiness was to emerge for Dr. Gunson and myself when the ACVSB came to examine the data generated from its evaluation of the first-generation HCV kits, when DHSS insisted that yet another evaluation should take place of second-generation kits before routine testing would be authorised. And I draw attention to that because some of the correspondence we've looked at would suggest that in terms at least of his written formal communications at the time, we can't obviously know about what conversations were taking place behind the scenes or between him and Dr. Gunson, but the communications we've looked at would suggest Professor Cash in agreement with this evaluation of the second generation test. So it's one of a number of, I think it might be said, tensions in relation to Professor Cash's evidence. There are a number of further questions. I'm not going to go through the detail of all of them. If we go over the page to page 8, Penrose Inquiry question 21 it is, why was it necessary to tie introduction of the test in the UK to approval by the FDA? And this was Professor Cash's response. Rightly or wrongly, I recall the FDA licensing process was regarded as important. There was a general view that the scientific processes of assessment of these diagnostic kits by the FDA were more rigorous and independent of political/commercial influences than in many countries, including the UK. That said, I recall that some were less certain that the issuing of FDA licenses was entirely independent of political US pressures. No kit licensing arrangements existed in the UK. And then if we turn next to page 11, please. We get on this page to the issue of the deferral of the start date in the course of 1991. So question 33 suggests that there was difficulty in moving the issue forward in the early part of 1991. And this was Professor Cash's response. To the best of my recollection, it was at the ACVS meeting of the 25th of February 1991 that the decision made in November 1990 to start routine donation screening in July 1991 was reversed. Though I'm not aware of any documents which confirm this, and I recall I was later advised by Dr. Gunson that he did not attend this meeting. But there is a document dated the 21st of February, 4 days before the ACVSB meeting, which seems to indicate that DHSS had already determined, without consultation with ACVSB, that there would be yet another kit evaluation, the second generation study. I was later advised, 23rd of March 1991, that SHHD had previously been consulted and had agreed to this second DHSS-inspired and unnecessary delay. Dr. Gunson advised NBTS directors and others of this position on the 3rd of April 1991. So you'll see in this statement Professor Cash expressing a degree of disagreement with what was taking place and suggesting that this was at the instigation of the Department of Health and that it was unnecessary. Again, you will no doubt wish to consider what he was saying in his formal communications at the time. Some of these are issues that he was pressed on during his oral evidence to the Penrose inquiry. It's also right to note that we are likely to have the benefit of it being able to examine this in more detail by reference to witnesses from the Department of Health or witnesses involved in the ACVSB decision-making. And we will be seeking to unpick the departmental decision-making process in later hearings. And then, if we go towards the bottom half of the page, you will see the last few lines refer to what Professor Cash described as some very distressing conversations with Dr. Gunson over the weekend before the ACTDD meeting of the 25th of March 1991, left me in no doubt that despite his letter of the 22nd of January to NBTS directors signalling the commencement of forward planning for a full HCV donation screening start day, this had been reversed by DHSS in early February 1991 against Dr. Gunson's wishes and without consultation with him or other members of ACVSB. Dr. Gunson also insisted that SHHD had been party to this decision and that both Departments of Health were extremely anxious that there would be no difficulties at the 25th of March ACTDD meeting. There was no reason at all why we could not have introduced screening using the first generation kits. Now, two questions arise in relation to that. The first is that right as a matter of fact? And that will be one of the many issues, sir, that you may need to consider when you consider why it took until the autumn of 1991 for screening to be introduced. So there is the general issue as to whether that's the case. But the second, specific to Professor Cash, is what was the view that was being expressed by him at the time?
When he wrote that unusual correspondence to Dr. Lloyd, expressing his view of Dr. Lloyd's breaking ranks, he didn't say, I happen to agree with your logic about introducing tests, but you really nonetheless have to bow to the majority. He didn't put it that way, did he?
He didn't, no. It's right to say that in his Penrose inquiry oral evidence, Professor Cash did talk on a number of occasions about the importance of there being a unified UK-wide position and a unified UK start date, and he continued to adhere to that. But you're absolutely right. He did not convey to Dr. Lloyd, nor I think to anyone else in the nor to Dr. Gunson, I should say, in the correspondence we've seen, a view that there was no reason why screening couldn't be introduced using the first generation kit. So it's open to you, sir, in due course, and having heard much more evidence and received submissions to conclude that that sentence is correct. But it begs the question of whether that was what was being said by Professor Cash at the time, and if it was not, why not?
Yes.
And of course, you're not going to have the ability to hear further from Professor Cash on that issue.
Or Professor Gunson.
Or Dr. Gunson, no. And then you will see, he then says, I was not aware, until sight of this witness statement request, I was not aware that Scottish ministers had not been briefed about the start date until 24th of July 1991. I suggest this is a matter of great significance and believe may give some support to Dr. Gunson's claim that SHA-8D officials have been party to the contrived further delay which had been conceived and implemented by DHSS officials. And again, that is an issue upon which he was questioned during his oral evidence as to some of the ways in which he characterised the DHSS's role. And then he continues I recall that Dr. Mitchell advised me that the ACVSB was aware of the existence of second-generation tests at its November 1990 meeting, but had agreed that an evaluation of these kits could be fitted in after the commencement of full screening using the first-generation test. It follows that for some reason there was a significant change in policy and that the ACVSB was not consulted. Certainly, the notion that the second-generation kits could have readily been evaluated soon after the introduction of routine HCV donation screening enjoyed the support of the SNBTS. Thus, earlier ministerial approval would also have enjoyed our support. The position adopted by the director of the Newcastle RTC, so Dr. Lloyd, in April-May 1991 proved to be very revealing. Among other things, I recall it had much to do with the proposition made to the SNBTS board in June 1991 that the SNBTS should emulate Newcastle, disregard the positions of SHHD and CSA, and establish full HCV donation screening ASAP. As I recall, it was a hotly contested debate, but the proposal was defeated. Some of us who opposed it viewed it as one which, if approved, could have triggered a descent into chaos, and hence my reference to a potential disaster. In my view, the disaster would have been the operational fragmentation of the UK BTS, but closer to home, the SNBTS. The impact of a fragmented UK BTS to the quality of care of UK patients would have been considerable. So there, Professor Cash is articulating the position consistent with the documents we've seen at the time, that there should be a universal, coordinated approach and not in individual areas taking their own course. So that's the written statement in relation to hepatitis C screening. There's then, in relation to surrogate testing, there was one document which I should have taken you to, sir, and didn't. So this goes back to 1986 and the question of surrogate testing. It's PRSE 0002109. And it was a letter from Professor Cash to Dr. Fraser in Bristol, NANB surrogate testing. And it says this: I have a feeling that as the drums are beating louder and louder in other parts of the world on this topic, the Brits remain fast asleep. I may be wrong, but I would like to be better briefed on this matter. And then he refers to raising the issue at an SNBTS directors meeting some months ago. We agreed you would explore the idea of setting up a UK prospective trial. I recall you saying to me that you pursued this at the NBTS directors meeting. I'm afraid I wasn't there, and it went down like the proverbial lead balloon. I'm bound to conclude that I feel we cannot leave the matter as it is and would value your comments on the suggestion that we, you and I, get down in the near future to plan a consensus meeting designed to look at the issues associated with NANB donation testing. I believe we should invite people from abroad, Harvey Alter, for instance. The purpose of the meeting, to which all UK BTS directors would be invited, would be to see whether we can reach conclusions which would enable us to make some clear operational decision, and that these would be transmitted to the various departments of health. So in any event, I refer to this, sir, because it's that concept of the drums beating louder and louder in other parts of the world while the Britons remain fast asleep, which is a powerful expression of Professor Cash's views on that issue. So the final issue in our written presentation is the issue of Professor Cash's involvement in the look-back exercise. Our time is to some extent constrained, and what I'm going to do before I deal briefly with that, if I may, is just give you and others the various references to Professor Cash's Penrose evidence. I've touched on some of the written statements, but so as to avoid the need in due course for everybody to go through the exercise the inquiry team has gone through of gathering them all together. I hope it will assist recognised legal representatives if I just give the references to all the written statements, and then I'll give the references to the oral transcripts. I don't think we've probably got time sensibly to go through the oral transcripts, but I can indicate where people will be able to find them. So there were a large number of written statements from Professor Cash on different topics, and they are as follows. in terms of references. PRSE 40491, that's cash on Z8, the Z8 product, and clinical trials. There's PRSE 40529, statement about the PFC. There's PRSE 40651, also a statement about Z8. PRSE 301273 is Professor Cash's statement about the look-back exercise. PRSE 301411 is concerned with ALT testing. Some of these are very short supplemental statements, some are much more detailed and lengthy statements. There's PRSE 302529, that's hepatitis screening, and we've just been looking at that statement. PRSE 302836 is on the topic of viral inactivation, so the heat treatment by the PFC. PRSE 303232 is about, it's relevant to questions of surrogate testing, essentially. PRSE 303395 is HIV/AIDS. PRSE 303463 is a further statement in relation to the PFC. PRSE 304020 is a statement from Professor Cash, amongst other things, in relation to a statement from Mr. David McIntosh. PRSE 304065, statement about surrogate testing. PRSE 304252 is an updated statement about HIV/AIDS. PRSE 304484 is about donor selection, prison blood collection, and also on the topic of donors, PRSE 304558. There is also a very short supplemental statement on a tiny topic. I can't remember off the top of my head what it was, but it's SBTS 302559. So those are the written statements. I hope that's all of them. If I've missed any, I'll ensure that information is corrected. And then Professor Cash gave evidence on a number of different occasions, taking them, it's oral evidence, taking them in chronological order. He gave evidence to the Penrose inquiry on the 23rd of April 2011, PRSE 306010, and that evidence was about high-risk donors, prison blood collection, and collection from donors with a history of jaundice. And then PRSE 000643 is Professor Cash's evidence on the 8th of September 2011. And that topic, that was topic B3, which I'm going to have to remind myself what topic B3 was now. Oh, I think that's viral inactivation. In any event, there's the transcript. Then there's his oral evidence on the 27th of September 2011, PRSE 000648. That's in relation to HIV/AIDS. He then gave evidence on the 27th of October 2011, PRSE 306057. And that, I think, was in relation to topic C3. It was again concerned, I think, with the position in relation to PFC, as I recall, but I can double check that. Then he gave evidence on the 16th of November 2011, PRSE 306064. That's on the question of surrogate testing. He gave evidence on the 29th of November 2011, PRSE 306070. That's a continuation of his evidence on surrogate testing and then a commencement of his evidence on hepatitis C testing. And he goes there into rather more detail about what he describes as the distressing conversations he had with Dr. Gunson, in particular about the deferral of the start date for HCV testing. So there is quite a lot that may be worth considering in his oral evidence there. And then 1st of December 2011 is, I think, a continuation of the evidence on that topic, PRSE 306072. And then he gave evidence on the 11th of January 2012, PRSE 306082. That's still on the issue of hepatitis C testing. And then I think his final oral evidence is on the 17th of January 2012, PRSE 306085, and that was in relation to the hepatitis C look-back. I'm not going to take you now, I think, sir, on reflection, to extracts from his oral testimony, because it is very difficult to follow without simultaneously looking at all of the documents that are being referred to during the oral examination. And otherwise, I would be at risk of plucking individual bits of his answers out of context without looking at what are hundreds and hundreds of pages of oral testimony. But no doubt, in due course, those who wish to make submissions about decision-making on these issues will be assisted by looking at the evidence that Professor Cash gave to Penrose. So can I then come finally, and by reference to the contemporaneous documentations, to Professor Cash's involvement in the look-back exercise. He told the Penrose inquiry he wasn't directly involved in the carrying out of the look-back exercise, but the documentation suggests he certainly had some involvement in the decision-making as regards whether, and if so, when and how it should be set up. And so if we start with, I think it's PRSE 301133. This is Professor Cash writing to his colleagues with an SMBTS on the 9th of July 1990. HCV look-back programme. As promised, I've discussed this topic with Harold Gunson. We both agreed the following: it would not, after we start anti-HCV donation screening, be appropriate to introduce a systematic look-back programme on previous recipients, as was done for HIV-1. It would be appropriate in the period before routine anti-HCV donation screening commences to examine the anti-HCV status of donors who have been implicated in a case of reported PTH. So there's what's said to be the agreement between Professor Cash and Dr. Gunson in mid-1990, of course, over a year before the hepatitis C screening was finally introduced. What we don't get from this letter is an understanding of what the reasoning was in relation to either of those positions. If we then look at it's NHBT 5073_007. This is a letter, October 1990, Professor Cash to Dr. Gunson. It's primarily concerned with the issue of donor counselling and a report from Jack Gillen. But if we go over to the top of the next page, we can see the issue of look back. He says, I would much appreciate your thoughts on the issue of look back. You will have noted that our team have indicated the need for a policy statement, and in their view, look back should be attempted. There were then discussions, there was then a letter from Dr. Gunson saying this would be considered by the Advisory Committee on Transfusion Transmitted Diseases in January 1991. The reference for that, I'm not proposing to go to it, is NHBT 5073_028. If, however, we look at... Sorry, just give me a moment because I haven't written down the reference. PRSC 301573. We can see Professor Cash writing to Dr. Mehta's Deputy CMO in November of 1990 in anticipation of the commencement of HCV blood donation testing throughout the UK in the foreseeable future. The Scottish National Blood Transfusion Service directors have asked me to write to you with a request that a policy of look back is considered by the Advisory Committee on the Virus Safety of Blood. Then we turn to PRSC 303568. We're now in February 1991. This is an internal SNBTS meeting, a meeting of its medical and scientific committee chaired by Professor Cash. And we will be able, I think, to pick some of these issues up with oral witnesses. But if we turn to page 4, there's a heading towards the top of the page about donor counselling and HCV donation testing. And then the next paragraph reads, in light of national events, and that is, I suspect, a reference to the fact that the testing programme had not yet commenced. It was agreed that no look back should be introduced at present. It's then, I think we then have to look to 1993 for the issue to be raised again by Professor Cash himself at PRSC 303928. So this is now 2 years after the introduction of the hepatitis C screening, or a little over 2 years after. Professor Cash wrote to Dr. Gunson in these terms: HCV confirmed positive donors look back. At a recent RCPE symposium on HCV, a distinguished speaker indicated that efforts ought to be made by the transfusion services in the first instance to track patients who'd received blood and blood components. He argued that some of these patients could benefit substantially from some modern therapeutic manoeuvre and that we had a duty to ensure this option was made available. This view was discussed at a recent meeting of the SNBTS Medical and Scientific Committee, and while it received support, colleagues stepped back from introducing a look-back policy until such times as further UK deliberations had taken place. It occurred to me it might be appropriate for the item to be researched for and discussed by MSBT. That's the Advisory Committee on the Microbiological Safety of Blood and Tissue, I think. Sorry, the acronyms become a little confusing. And then if we look at PRSC 303685, this is a discussion now in May of 1994 of the SNBTS Medical and Scientific Committee, chaired by Professor Cash. We can pick up the position in relation to look back at the bottom of page 5. Where it said, this very complex and extremely important issue was discussed at length. The committee unanimously agreed that on finding a known or regular donor who was now anti-HCV POS, the SNBTS should, and then there are a number of proposed steps set out. So the first is retest previous archive samples to exclude missed seroconversion. 2 is for donations issued to hospital blood banks, other RTCs, etc. The SNBTS will provide certain information to the clinician. 3 sets out the proposal in relation to donations issued to named patients by SNBTS blood banks. And then 4, it was agreed that the procedure to be followed would be based on that outlined in a forthcoming publication on the subject in transfusion medicine. And then 5, from an SHHD perspective, AK, and that is Dr. Aileen Keel, expressed the view that the SHHT may not have a locus in this matter and that the SNBTS should make a decision on look-back for HCV that was based on their professional judgment. However, before SNBTS took any action, AK asked to be given the opportunity to discuss the issues with SHHD colleagues, to seek their views, and asked that the SNBTS take no formal action until she'd subsequently contacted JDC, that's Professor Cash. Once AK had communicated the SHHD position to Professor Cash and provided SHHD were in agreement that the SNBTS should implement this policy, JDC would write to D. McClelland to provide details of the SNBTS policy, thereby allowing a decision to be taken on a starting date for the process. Professor Cash also would formally advise NBA, NIBTS, SACT and MSBT of the SNBTS policy. We're definitely in acronym soup by now. 7, if SHHD agreed that SNBTS should develop and implement a look-back policy for HCV, Dr. Keel subsequently would communicate this to the Department of Health. So that's the discussion which took place there, and again, we'll be able to unpick some of the decision-making here with later witnesses. There's a reference at NHBT 20095526_0026 to there being pressure to promote a look-back policy. Do you need that reference again, Shane? NHBT 00955526.
It's maybe the underscore might be
Yes,
026.
Yes, it may be. Thank you, Shemik. So it's a letter. This is, in fact, from Dr. Aller to a doctor at the liver unit of the Queen Elizabeth Hospital in Birmingham, but it's about hepatitis C look back. And you'll see that Dr. Aller is writing.
For those who want to follow this, Dr. Aller was in charge of the transfusion, the regional transfusion centre in the West Midlands, was he?
Yes. And he was writing here in his capacity as chair of the Advisory Committee on Transfusion-Transmitted Infection, and he says, I've been under some pressure to promote a look-back policy for all those patients who receive blood products from donors we subsequently found to be anti-HCV positive when screening was introduced to the BTS. The advocates of this policy, mainly the Scottish National Blood Transfusion Service, argue that. And then we can see the reasoning that's being set out there. Interferon alone or in combination with ribavirin will arrest progression of liver disease and disappearance of viral RNA in a large proportion of patients, over 60%. Just pausing there. And again, we'll see this as we look at look-back issues in more detail with witnesses or by way of further presentations. But one of the themes was, is there any point in doing a look-back if there's no treatment that we can give to patients? Now, maybe a number of obvious answers to that, or perhaps some less obvious answers to that. But in any event, what's being said here was there is now a treatment and therefore a greater obligation to trace people who may have been infected with hepatitis C. And so we see that from the second point. We have a moral duty to counsel these individuals with an eye to making this potentially effective treatment available to them. Even though sexual transmission is reportedly low with HCV, we should nevertheless provide cautionary advice because the situation is not yet clear. And top of the next page, we risk public and media opprobrium for being either negligent or secretive. There are then set out potential reasons for not undertaking such a policy. So the reasons for undertaking it were those being put forward, was, it said, mainly by the Scottish directors. The contrary reasons given here: it will create unnecessary anxiety, little will be gained for the effort and expense involved, long-term results of interferon ribavirin therapy are not yet available, we will generate the very adverse media publicity we would seek to avoid. And then the letter continues to say that I've convened an ad hoc meeting in Birmingham, 5th of August 1994, to discuss this issue and attempt to reach some policy decision. This will not be easy, and I know Professor Cash and Professor Tedder do favour doing a look back, while several others are agnostic. So that's what's being recorded as Professor Cash's position by that time. There was a paper produced by Professor Cash for, I think it is for that meeting. No, it may be for a later meeting. I think it's produced arising out of that meeting. Sorry, PRSE 301236. So it's HCV Look Back, Professor Cash. And if we go over the page, you'll see it's headed Recommendations of the Standing Advisory Committee on Transfusion Transmitted Infection to the NHBT concerning the merits of adopting an HCV look-back policy. And then it refers to the meeting on the 5th of August to which Dr. Arlo had made reference. An ad hoc assembly of experts met on the 5th of August 1994 to discuss the feasibility of initiating a look-back policy to identify, test, counsel, and, if necessary, refer surviving past recipients of blood components from donors later found to be anti-HCV seropositive after testing was introduced in September 1991. I won't go through the detail of the report. If we just go to page 4 and look at the summary, it says the SACTI, that is the Standing Advisory Committee on Transfusion Transmitted Infection, feels there is a serious case for considering a look-back policy for HCV. To do otherwise when a look-back programme for HIV already exists suggests double standards. The wider implications of such a policy will need further consideration, and the SACTI recommends that the Hepatitis Advisory Group and the NHBT consider the matter further as soon as possible. There are further discussions both within Scotland and nationally, but I think we'll probably pick those up more usefully with later witnesses. In early 1995, Professor Cash wrote to Dr. Metters with some suggestions about the look-back, which by this stage had been agreed in principle. I won't go to that letter, but the reference for the transcript is NHBT 305835. Perhaps the final document just to look at on this issue is STHB 40687. So this is October 1995. It's a meeting of the SNBTS Medical and Scientific Committee. So this is a point in time at which the look back, the national look back exercise has been decided upon. If we go to page 4, I'm not proposing to go through the detail, but there's a heading HCV look back and an update of the SNBTS position. Perhaps the only subparagraph that I should highlight for present purposes is subparagraph 4, with respect to recipients of blood components pre-HCV testing. The MSC agreed that testing of available donor archive samples would be neither cost-effective nor appropriate, that an offer to test anyone who had received blood components or products prior to HCV screening was likely to be the most effective option, that this latter option should not be pursued until the present HCV look-back exercise was substantively complete, and then finally that the sample collection and testing process should be provided by the blood transfusion services. So that's an update of the internal position whilst the look-back exercise nationally was ongoing. and that, I think, effectively concluded Professor Cash's involvement directly with the issue. So, sir, almost on time. That's the presentation in relation to Professor Cash. You will appreciate, and I hope those listening will appreciate, there is a vast amount of material generated by Professor Cash, directed to Professor Cash, or into which he was copied, and an even wider volume of material in relation to the decisions and actions of SNBTS more generally. So this is an introduction and an overview rather than an exhaustive exercise. But I hope it assists in identifying a number of themes that will then be picked up with oral witnesses over the coming weeks.
Yes, well, thank you. I think it's been very helpful. We'll take a break now then until 2:05, when I expect we'll hear from Miss Scott, will we?
We will hear from Miss Scott.
And she'll be telling us about Dr. Gunson.
Exactly, yes.